It began on a Monday evening so still that the silence in the Vale mansion felt heavier than the crystal chandelier hanging above the entrance hall. Rain tapped against the long windows in soft, stubborn patterns, and somewhere in the east wing a grandfather clock counted the seconds like a judge waiting to deliver a sentence. The staff moved carefully in that house, not because anyone had told them to tiptoe, but because grief had its own rules, and everyone knew that grief lived there like a second owner. Adrian Vale stood by the library window with one hand in his pocket and the other wrapped around a glass he had not touched in almost an hour. At 39, he had the kind of face magazines like to call commanding. Sharp jaw, dark eyes, the tired authority of a man who had built empires out of discipline and sleepless nights. He owned hotels, logistics firms, and half a biotech company on the verge of some breakthrough the newspapers couldn't stop speculating about. He had been photographed at charity galas, on the decks of yachts, beside governors and founders and foreign investors. But none of that power mattered in the room above him, where his 8-year-old son had not spoken a full sentence in 7 months. Theo used to talk with his hands and his whole body. He used to ask questions that arrived in bunches, one after another, until even his mother laughed and begged him to take a breath. Then came the crash on the coastal road. The black rain, the guardrail bent like paper, the ambulance lights rolling across wet asphalt, Clara's hand going cold before Adrian even reached the hospital. Theo survived. Clara didn't, and afterward the boy folded in on himself so completely it was as if someone had blown out every candle inside him one by one. Doctors called it traumatic mutism. Specialists called it a grief response. Therapists called it a process. Adrian called it the failure he woke up with every morning. He heard the soft knock before turning. "Sir," said Mrs. Briggs, the housekeeper, standing in the doorway in her perfect charcoal uniform. "The new maid has arrived." Adrian closed his eyes for the smallest fraction of a second. He had not asked for a new maid. He had asked for efficiency. But in large homes, efficiency always arrived disguised as hiring. "She's replacing Marta in the children's wing," Mrs. Briggs continued. "Temporary, unless she proves suitable." Adrian gave one small nod. "Send her in." Mrs. Briggs stepped aside, and the woman who entered did not look like what Adrian expected. She was younger than he had imagined, perhaps 28 or 29, with dark hair gathered in a simple knot and a plain navy dress that fit too modestly to have been chosen for impression. She had the posture of someone used to hard work and the alert eyes of someone who had learned that rooms could turn dangerous without warning. There was nothing flashy about her. No perfume announced her. No false smile did either. "Elena Cruz," she said quietly. "Thank you for the opportunity, sir." Her voice was steady. Not timid. Not bold. Simply steady. Adrian looked at her the way he looked at everyone these days, with distance already in place before the interaction began. "You'll receive instructions from Mrs. Briggs," he said. "You are not to improvise. Theo keeps to a routine. Do not force conversation. Do not ask personal questions. If he refuses a meal, inform the nurse. If he has an episode, call Dr. Levin's office immediately." Elena listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Understood." Adrian expected some version of pity, curiosity, or the especially irritating sort of kindness people adopted around damaged families. Instead, she only lowered her eyes once in acknowledgement. He should have dismissed her then. Instead he added, colder than necessary, "And one more thing. My son is not a project." Something flickered in her expression then. Not offense. Something closer to recognition. "No, sir," she said softly. "He's your son." For the first time all day, Adrian actually looked at the person standing in front of him. Mrs. Briggs cleared her throat, perhaps startled by the answer. "If that's all," the housekeeper began. "It is," Adrian said. Elena turned to leave. He didn't know why he watched her walk away. Perhaps because she moved without the shrinking uncertainty most new staff carried on their first day. Or perhaps because in a house full of people trained to perform deference, she seemed to possess something less polished and more dangerous: self-respect. By 8:30 that night, Theo had refused dinner. By 9, he had locked himself in the music room. By 9:15, One of the footmen reported he had thrown a porcelain lamp hard enough to shatter the shade and cut his palm. Adrian found him curled beneath the Steinway grand piano, knees to chest, shoulders rigid, eyes open but unreachable. Blood marked the polished wood floor in tiny drops, bright and accusing. "Theo." Adrian crouched, his voice measured. "Come out." The boy pressed farther back into the darkness. Mrs. Briggs hovered near the door. A nurse stood with a first aid kit. No one dared step forward. "Leave us," Adrian said. No one moved. Then, from behind him, Elena's voice. "May I try something?" Adrian turned so sharply the nurse looked down at once. "No." Elena did not retreat. "I won't touch him. I said no." Theo made a small sound then, not quite a cry, not quite a gasp. Just enough to slice through the room. Elena kept her gaze on the child beneath the piano, not on Adrian. "If I'm wrong," she said, "I'll step out immediately." It was the audacity of it that almost made him throw her out on the spot. A maid, on her first day, offering judgment inside a grief-ridden room full of professionals. Yet something in her tone held no challenge. Only urgency. Adrian stood. "You have 30 seconds. Elena nodded once. Then, instead of crouching near Theo, she sat down on the floor several feet away with slow, visible movements. She folded her hands loosely in her lap and stared not at him, but at the underside of the piano. For 5 seconds she said nothing. Then she whispered, so quietly that the room itself seemed to lean in. "When I was little," she said, "I used to hide under my grandmother's kitchen table whenever the grown-ups shouted. It looked like the safest roof in the world." Theo's eyes flicked once. Elena continued in the same hush. "Tables and pianos are good roofs. They make you feel like the world has to ask permission before it can reach you." The nurse glanced at Adrian. He said nothing. "I'm Elena," she whispered. "I won't ask you to come out yet. But if your hand hurts, you can slide it toward me, and I'll put the bandage close enough for you to grab." Theo did not move. Elena waited. Rain tapped the windows. The clock in the hallway struck the quarter hour. Somewhere below stairs a door opened and shut. Then, slowly, Theo extended his bleeding hand into the slice of light. Elena did not lunge, did not praise, did not turn it into a moment. She placed the bandage on the floor. "Good," she murmured. "You can take it when you're ready." He stared at it for a long time. Then he took it. Adrian felt something inside his chest shift so sharply it almost resembled pain. Theo wrapped the bandage clumsily with one hand. Elena reached into her apron pocket, drew out another strip of gauze, and placed that down too. "For the second try," she whispered. "The first one is always practice." A full minute passed before Theo crawled forward enough for her to help him finish. She cleaned the cut with such gentleness that even the nurse seemed embarrassed by comparison. Not once did Theo speak. Not once did Elena ask him to. When it was done, she rose and stepped back as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "Thank you," she said to Theo. Then she turned to Adrian and lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry if I overstepped." Adrian stared at her. The correct response would have been a warning, a reminder of boundaries, a clear assertion that momentary success did not grant permission. Instead he heard himself say, "Take him upstairs." Mrs. Briggs looked shocked. Elena only nodded. "Yes, sir." Theo did not resist when she held out her hand. That was the first thing Adrian saw. The second was stranger, as mother and son. No, maid and child, he corrected himself. Crossed the threshold, Theo glanced back toward Adrian with an expression that looked painfully close to accusation. Not because Adrian had been cruel, because he had not known what to do. That night Adrian did not go to bed. He went instead to the old security office on the 3rd floor, the one no one used anymore since the system had been digitized. He sat before a bank of small monitors that showed the halls, the staircases, the front gates, the playroom, the conservatory. One camera remained in the old nursery suite next to Theo's room. It had been installed years earlier when Clara insisted on keeping a baby monitor system long after Theo no longer needed one. Adrian had forgotten it was still connected to the internal audio channel. Forgotten, until he heard a soft crackle. Then Elena's whisper. "At this hour," she said. "All brave boys are allowed to be tired." Adrian froze. The monitor showed Theo in bed beneath the blue quilt Clara had chosen with tiny stitched constellations across it. Elena sat in the chair by the window, lamp dimmed low, a book closed in her lap. Theo faced the wall. "You don't have to talk to me," she whispered. "I just don't think children should fall asleep in a house this sad, without someone telling them it isn't their fault." Adrian's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. On screen, Elena looked toward Theo, not knowing she was being heard by anyone else. "Sometimes fathers become very quiet," she said gently. "Not because they stop loving, because they are loving so hard they don't know how to survive it." Theo's shoulders trembled once. "And sometimes sons think silence will keep everyone safe." Adrian felt the blood leave his face. He should have turned off the audio then. He knew that. It was private, intimate, not meant for him. But grief makes cowards out of men who seem fearless in daylight, and Adrian sat there in the blue monitor glow listening like a thief. "What happened?" Elena whispered. "Was not your fault." Theo pulled the blanket higher. "It wasn't your fault your mother died. It wasn't your fault the rain came. It wasn't your fault the car went over. And it isn't your job to make your father suffer as much as you do so he can prove he remembers her." A long silence followed. Then, almost soundless, Theo turned his face toward her. Adrian leaned forward as if the gesture itself could draw words out of the room. But Theo only shut his eyes. Elena tucked the blanket near his shoulder and stood. Before leaving, she whispered one final sentence that Adrian carried with him the rest of the night. "One day," she said, "you'll speak when it feels safe. Until then, I'll listen to your silence." The room went dark. Adrian stayed where he was long after the screen showed nothing but the pale shape of his sleeping son. He told himself he would shut off the old audio system in the morning. He told himself what he had done was wrong. He told himself the maid would be reassigned to another wing before she decided that kindness entitled her to influence. But the next night he listened again. And the next. Within a week he understood two things with unbearable clarity. First, Elena never used those quiet hours to turn Theo against him. She did the opposite. She spent them stitching broken trust back together, one whisper at a time. Second, Theo was changing. It happened in small ways, subtle enough that anyone less desperate than Adrian might have missed them. The boy stopped flinching when a door shut too loudly. He ate half a piece of toast at breakfast. He stood in the garden for almost 10 minutes one cloudy morning while Elena showed him how raindrops gathered at the tips of rose leaves before falling. Twice Adrian passed them in the hallway and pretended not to notice when Theo, usually so rigid near strangers, allowed Elena to adjust the collar of his sweater. He pretended not to notice because he did not know what else to do. And that became the shape of those weeks. The millionaire who seemed to ignore the maid, and the maid who whispered his son back toward life while the millionaire listened from shadows. Vanessa Harrow noticed before anyone else that something was shifting. Vanessa had known Adrian for 6 years. She was elegant in the expensive, curated way society magazines adored. Pale silk blouses, careful laughter, diamonds that looked effortless precisely because they were not. After Clara's death, Vanessa began appearing more often, at first as a friend of the family, then a charitable advisor, then something less clearly named and therefore more dangerous. She brought catered lunches no one touched and arranged foundation meetings Adrian didn't remember approving. She spoke about Theo with concern that always sounded like strategy wearing the mask of tenderness. One Thursday afternoon she arrived in a cream coat and found Elena kneeling beside Theo in the winter garden, helping him line up smooth stones by size on the brick border of the fountain. Vanessa stopped in the doorway. "What exactly is this?" Elena rose at once. "He wanted the white stones separated." "I didn't ask him," Vanessa said coolly. Then to Theo, in a voice so polished it almost glinted, "Darling, your father has guests arriving. This is not a time for staff games." Theo lowered his head at once. Elena's hand curled at her side. Adrian had stepped into the corridor just in time to hear the exchange. Vanessa turned, startled. "Adrian, I didn't know you were there." That's evident, he said. For one brief second something annoyed and sharp crossed Vanessa's face before she arranged it away. I'm only saying the household should be careful. Boundaries matter. Elena kept her eyes lowered. Adrian looked from Vanessa to his son, whose shoulders had drawn inward again with that familiar collapse he had come to hate in himself because he recognized it too late every time. Then he said, Theo can arrange stones if he likes. Vanessa smiled too slowly. Of course. She crossed the room and kissed Adrian lightly on the cheek, more for the audience than the affection. I'll wait in the study. When she was gone, the air felt easier. Elena knelt again, but Theo had stopped sorting. Go on, Adrian said, though he wasn't sure to whom. Elena looked up. Yes, sir. Only when he walked away did he realize she was not thanking him for permission. She was obeying an instruction he had not consciously given. Continue. That night on the monitor, Elena's voice came softer than usual. Some grown-ups, she whispered into the dim room, speak like silk and mean rope. Theo's blanket shifted. But we don't have to untangle everything tonight. Pause. Would you like me to tell you the story of the boy who collected storms? Theo's hand emerged from beneath the quilt and tapped once against the mattress. Adrian realized, with a shock so sudden it almost embarrassed him, that this was Theo's version of yes. Elena smiled, though only the side of her face showed on camera. Once, she began, there was a boy who thought thunder followed him because the sky was angry. Her stories were never really children's stories. They were parables dressed in soft edges. Boys who believed broken things could never be mended. Girls who carried cracked lanterns and discovered the light still worked. Fathers who built walls high enough to keep out pain and accidentally locked out joy. She never made Adrian the villain. That was what undid him most. By the middle of the second week, he knew fragments of Elena's life without her ever telling him directly. Some were things he inferred from the whispered stories. Some he learned from personnel files he hated himself for reading. Her mother had died when she was 19. She had left nursing school after 1 year to care for her younger brother, Matteo, who now lived with a hearing impairment after a childhood illness. She worked 2 jobs before Mrs. Briggs hired her through an agency with excellent references and a note that described her as calm under pressure, discreet, dependable. Dependable. It was a small word for a woman who entered collapsing places and made them breathable. One evening Adrian found her in the pantry after midnight, sitting on an overturned crate with a sewing kit beside her, mending Theo's torn pajama cuff by the light above the service sink. You're off duty, he said. Elena stood immediately. I know. I'm sorry. I only needed 10 more minutes. What are you doing? She looked at the fabric in her hands. Fixing this. There are people paid to replace clothes. She gave the faintest shrug. Replacing is more expensive than repairing. It was such a plain answer that he had no immediate reply. Then he noticed the open lunch tin on the shelf beside her. Inside were pills in a neat row, a folded bus pass, and an envelope addressed to Matteo Cruz. Do you live nearby? He asked before he could stop himself. Elena seemed surprised by the question. 40 minutes by bus. That late? She nodded. It takes longer after 11. Adrian looked at the envelope again. Your brother. Her expression changed. Not closed exactly. Cautious. Yes. The silence that followed was not hostile. Only strange. A billionaire and a maid standing in a pantry at midnight with a torn pajama cuff between them like evidence that life could become intimate in absurd, narrow ways. You should charge overtime, Adrian said finally. To his annoyance, she almost smiled. You already pay what was agreed. That wasn't an answer. It was the polite version. There it was again, that thing in her he could not categorize. Not insolence. Dignity without theater. Adrian should have ended the exchange. Instead he said, Mrs. Briggs tells me Theo sleeps better after you sit with him. Elena lowered her eyes. He sleeps when he feels less alone. That's not what I asked. No, she said, but it's the truth. He heard, in memory, her whisper on the monitor. Some fathers become very quiet. His jaw tightened. You speak very freely to staff for someone in your position, he said, knowing even as he spoke that the sentence was crueler than it needed to be. Elena absorbed it without visible injury. I speak carefully, sir. There's a difference. Then she folded the pajama cuff, set it neatly on the counter, and asked permission to leave with so much formal grace that the rebuke returned to Adrian like a slap he had delivered to himself. The third week brought the first real breakthrough. It happened in the kitchen, of all places. Theo had begun appearing there in the mornings because Elena had invented a ritual she called silent breakfast engineering. She laid out fruit, bread, and small bowls of nuts, then asked Theo, through gesture, not speech, to decide where each item should go so the table stays balanced. At first he only pointed. Then he moved pieces himself. Then he began arranging entire place settings with focused, solemn precision. On the morning Adrian walked in unexpectedly, Theo was standing on a low stool while Elena held a plate near him. Captain, she whispered with mock seriousness, if the strawberries go on the left, the toast must go on the right or we will have maritime disaster. Theo's mouth twitched. Adrian stopped in the doorway. Neither of them noticed him. Theo moved the toast. Elena placed her hand dramatically on her heart as if disaster had been narrowly avoided. Then very softly, so softly Adrian almost believed he imagined it, Theo whispered, "Need two." Elena froze. The kitchen froze with her. Adrian felt time split open. "Two." Elena echoed in a voice so gentle it barely stirred the air. Theo nodded once, eyes fixed stubbornly on the plate, as though ashamed of the sound he had made. "For balance," he whispered. Adrian gripped the doorframe hard enough to whiten his knuckles. Elena did something extraordinary then. She did not cry, did not gasp, did not celebrate. She simply reached for another piece of toast as though boys whispered every morning and the world had not just shifted on its axis. "Of course," she said. "Two for balance." Theo exhaled. Only then did Elena glance toward the doorway and see Adrian. Their eyes met. There was wonder in hers, but also warning. "Don't break this." Adrian understood. He walked in as if nothing unusual had happened, as if his heart were not pounding in his throat like a fist. "Good morning," he said. Theo's shoulders stiffened, but he did not run. Adrian sat at the table and unfolded the financial paper he had no intention of reading. After a moment, Elena placed coffee beside him. "Anything else, sir?" He looked at the boy on the stool, arranging strawberries with grave concentration. "Yes," Adrian said, without taking his eyes off Theo. "Leave the toast." That afternoon, Vanessa arrived with a specialist from Zurich she said had an exceptional reputation with selective mutism. Adrian dismissed them both in under 3 minutes. She followed him into the hall afterward, heels striking marble like accusations. "You are sabotaging his recovery," she hissed. "Children like Theo require structure and professional intervention, not emotional dependence on house staff." Adrian turned. "Children like Theo?" Vanessa lifted her chin. "You know what I mean." "No," he said quietly. "Actually, I don't." Her mouth tightened. "Adrian, this is not about sentiment. It's about appearances, consistency, long-term care. You cannot let a maid become indispensable in this house." The sentence echoed in him for reasons Vanessa did not understand. Because it was already too late. That same night, the whisper Adrian heard through the old monitor changed everything. Theo had seemed restless at bedtime. He resisted sleep, kept sitting up, then lying back down, twisting the quilt at its corners. Elena remained by the window, patient as always, waiting him out. Finally she whispered, "Something is pressing on your chest tonight." Theo stared at the dark. "You can tell me in pieces," she said. "Secrets come out easier when they aren't asked to be whole." Long silence. Then the faint scrape of fabric. Theo had turned toward her. "When—" His voice snagged, rusted from disuse. "When Mama—" He stopped. Elena leaned forward only slightly. "Take your time." Theo swallowed. Adrian, in the security office, forgot to breathe. "When Mama drove—" "Rain night," Theo whispered. "Lady in red was there." Adrian's entire body went still. Elena did not react outwardly. At the house. Theo nodded. In the garage? Another nod. She said. His face crumpled. She said break's done. Mama cried. Adrian's glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the concrete floor of the security office. On screen, Theo flinched at nothing he could hear. Elena's voice stayed level, though Adrian now heard the tension beneath it. Who was the lady in red? Theo shook his head violently. No names, Elena whispered. All right, no names. She saw me, Theo said, barely audible. After, in hospital, said if I tell, Dad breaks too. Adrian sat down hard in the chair behind him because his knees had ceased to belong to him. 7 months. 7 months of police reports, closed files, condolences, signatures, and a death deemed accidental because a wet road and bad brakes were easier for everyone to live with than murder. Theo knew something. Theo had been carrying it alone, and someone had used that fear to keep him silent. Elena, Theo whispered, his first clear use of her name. Don't tell. The maid closed her eyes briefly. I won't do anything tonight, she said. I promise. But I need you to hear me very carefully. Theo's breathing trembled. What happened to your mother was not because of you. What that woman said to you was a lie. Your father is not weak because he loved her. And if danger is real, grown-ups must carry it. Not children. Adrian covered his mouth with his hand. Will you stay? Theo asked. Elena's answer came without hesitation. Yes. Adrian did not sleep at all that night. At 6 in the morning he was already in his private office with a locked door, a fresh copy of Clara's accident file spread across the desk, and a retired investigator named Malcolm Shore on speakerphone. I need you back on a case, Adrian said. There was a pause. I thought that one was closed. It isn't. What changed? Adrian looked toward the east windows, where dawn was struggling through rain clouds. My son remembered something. He did not say more. Not because he did not trust Malcolm, but because speaking the truth aloud made it real in a way paper and grief never had. By noon, Malcolm had reopened every thread the original inquiry abandoned. Brake reports, garage access logs, security archives from the week before the crash, payroll irregularities, foundation transfers Clara had reviewed before her death. By evening, Adrian had done something harder than hiring an investigator. He had acted normally. He met Vanessa for tea in the conservatory and asked polite questions about the upcoming Vale Foundation Gala. He let her discuss donor lists and seating. He watched her elegant hands circle the rim of her porcelain cup and remembered Theo's whisper. Lady in red. Vanessa wore red often. So had Clara. Half the women in Adrian's social world wore red. Still, when Vanessa smiled and said, You look exhausted, Adrian had to resist the urge to ask whether she enjoyed sleeping in houses built on other women's graves. Instead he said, A lot on my mind. She reached across the table and touched his wrist. You don't have to carry everything alone. For a moment Adrian thought he might be physically sick. That night he did something he should have done months earlier. He went to Theo's room before the maid arrived. The boy was awake, sitting upright with his knees drawn to his chest, eyes wary in the moonlight. Adrian stood just inside the doorway, suddenly unsure how fathers entered rooms they had emotionally abandoned without permission. I won't stay long, he said. Theo stared. Adrian crossed to the bed and sat in the chair Elena usually occupied. The absence of her there felt like a mirror held to his failures. I need to tell you something, Adrian said. And you don't have to answer. Theo's fingers tightened around the quilt. When your mother died, I thought being strong meant not falling apart where you could see it. Adrian looked down at his hands. I think what you saw instead was me leaving you alone inside the same pain. Theo blinked hard. I am sorry, Adrian said. And the words felt too small for the ruin they were meant to address. Not in the easy adult way. In the real way. In the way that means I know I was wrong. Theo's lower lip trembled. Adrian leaned forward but did not touch him. You never have to protect me from the truth, he said. Never. The boy's face folded. Not into panic this time. Into grief. Dad. he whispered. It was only one word. Adrian broke. Not elegantly. Not with restrained tears slipping down an otherwise composed face. He bent over as if struck, hand pressed against his mouth, the force of months tearing through him in one jagged breath. Theo watched him, terrified. Adrian forced himself upright. I'm all right, he lied. Theo shook his head and did something Adrian had not dared hope for again. He held out his arms. When Adrian gathered him close, the child felt both smaller and heavier than memory. Theo buried his face in his father's shoulder and shook with silent sobs that seemed to have been waiting 7 months for permission. Elena stopped in the open doorway then, unnoticed at first. When Adrian finally looked up and saw her, she had already stepped back, giving them the mercy of privacy. But their eyes met for 1 second. In hers he saw no triumph, only relief. 3 days later Malcolm returned with the first real crack in the past. Clara had been auditing foundation accounts privately before her death. Not because the foundation was failing, but because she suspected funds were being redirected through shell vendors linked to a consulting arm Vanessa had brought in the year before. One name surfaced repeatedly. Simon Reeve, Adrian's chief financial officer, and a man who had once prided himself on being invisible when necessary. Garage access logs from the night of the crash had been partially erased. Not fully. Partially. Enough to miss on routine review, not enough to disappear under forensic reconstruction. Someone had entered the service bay 37 minutes before Clara left. A woman's keycard, assigned to Vanessa Harrow. Malcolm placed the printed record on Adrian's desk without comment. Adrian stared at it. He had known betrayal in business, hostile takeovers, board ambushes, lawsuits masquerading as partnerships. But personal betrayal operates differently. Business betrayal insults your judgment. Personal betrayal desecrates your memory. She could still claim she entered for any number of reasons, Malcolm said carefully. I know. We need more. Adrian's gaze hardened. Then get more. More came sooner than expected and from Elena. Not intentionally. That was what made it matter. She found the letter by accident while clearing the cedar chest in the old upstairs sitting room Clara once used for wrapping gifts. Mrs. Briggs had assigned her the task because gala guests would be touring the upper hall and the dust smell is unacceptable. Inside the chest were winter blankets, dried lavender sachets, and a false bottom warped just enough at one corner to show a seam. Elena lifted it and found an envelope addressed in Clara's unmistakable handwriting. If anything happens, give this to Adrian. Elena stood frozen in the dust-lit room, the envelope in one hand, her other pressed to her mouth. She should have taken it to Mrs. Briggs. She should have left it untouched. She should have done a dozen proper things. Instead, she went directly to Adrian's office and knocked once. When he opened the door and saw her face, he knew before she spoke that something had changed. I found this, she said. He took the envelope as though it might explode. Clara's handwriting undid him more efficiently than any grief counselor ever had. He opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a 2-page letter and a flash drive. The letter was not melodramatic. Clara had never been melodramatic. It was precise, furious, and heartbreakingly calm. She wrote that she believed Simon was stealing from the foundation and that Vanessa was helping him bury it through donor laundering schemes disguised as international outreach. She had confronted Vanessa privately and been told, with a smile, that men like Adrian see what they expect to see. Clara wrote that if Adrian was reading the letter, she had likely failed to expose them in time. At the bottom, one line was underlined twice. Do not let Theo grow up in a house where charm is mistaken for goodness. Adrian sat down because the room no longer held steady. Elena remained near the door, hands clasped, eyes lowered. How long have you had it? He asked. I found it 3 minutes ago. Did you read it? She hesitated. Yes. A more fragile man might have lashed out. But there were no layers left in Adrian for pride. Thank God, he said. Her eyes lifted in surprise. He held up the flash drive. You may have just given me what the police missed. For the first time since she began working there, Elena allowed emotion to show plainly on her face. Not self-congratulation, sorrow. Sorrow for Clara, for Theo, perhaps even for the man sitting broken at a desk built for command. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded once. "So am I." The gala went ahead as planned. That was Adrian's idea. Malcolm wanted immediate arrest attempts. Lawyers wanted a controlled corporate response. Mrs. Briggs wanted staff instructed to say nothing and look invisible. Vanessa wanted everything exactly as scheduled because, apparently, evil prefers champagne chilled and donors seated alphabetically. Adrian agreed to the gala for one reason. Guilty people are easiest to trap when they believe the stage still belongs to them. The Vale Foundation ballroom glittered that night with enough money to rebuild small countries and enough hypocrisy to sink them. Crystal towers of white roses framed the stage. String music drifted over low conversation. News cameras hovered near the sponsor wall. Vanessa moved through the room in a scarlet gown so precisely chosen it felt like a confession wrapped in silk. Lady in red. Theo had not attended foundation events since the accident, but this year Adrian insisted on keeping him upstairs in the private family suite with Elena and Dr. Levin nearby. It was safer that way. Theo didn't argue. He rarely argued anymore. He simply held Elena's hand before the guests arrived and whispered, "Don't go far." "I won't," she promised. By 9:15 the ballroom was full. By 9:20 Adrian stepped onto the stage. The room quieted at once. Wealth always knows when to look up at itself. He thanked donors. He spoke briefly about Clara's vision, about children's literacy, about grief becoming action. Vanessa stood near the front with one hand resting lightly at her waist, the picture of composed partnership. Then Adrian said, "Before we continue, there are two people I would like to acknowledge. My wife, Clara Vale, who built this foundation with honesty I did not fully appreciate until after her death. And my son Theo, whose courage has given me reason to revisit truths I should never have overlooked." Vanessa's smile thinned. A screen lowered behind him. Simon Reeve, across the ballroom, set down his glass too quickly. Adrian continued in the same measured tone. "The Vale Foundation was created to protect vulnerable families. It will not be used to enrich cowards." The first document appeared on the screen. Foundation transfers routed through shell vendors. A murmur swept the room. Then Clara's letter. Then the garage access logs. Then a still image from restored service corridor footage showing Vanessa entering the garage the night Clara died. Gasps, this time sharper. Vanessa moved first. "This is outrageous." Adrian turned toward her at last. "Is it?" She mounted the stage in 3 furious strides, forgetting elegance entirely. "You are humiliating me in front of donors based on manipulated files and the fantasy of a traumatized child." The ballroom inhaled. Adrian's face changed then. Only slightly. But those who knew power recognized the moment it stopped pretending civility mattered. "My son," he said quietly, "is not available for your use anymore." Vanessa opened her mouth, but before she could speak the side doors swung inward. Malcolm entered with 2 detectives. Simon made for the rear exit and was intercepted by hotel security. Camera shutters began exploding like small fireworks. Vanessa turned pale beneath the ballroom lights. "Adrian, please. We can discuss this privately." "Did you discuss it privately with Clara?" he asked. "Before or after you arranged for the brakes to be tampered with?" "I did not kill her." Came out too fast. Too loud. The room changed. Everyone heard it, the shift from offended innocence to panic self-defense. Malcolm stepped forward. "Ms. Harrow, Mr. Reeve, you'll need to come with us." Vanessa laughed then, high and brittle. "On what charge?" "Conspiracy, fraud, evidence tampering," Malcolm said. "Murder will depend on what your mechanic decides to confirm before sunrise." Her head snapped toward him. Adrian saw the answer there before she spoke. She had not expected the mechanic to talk. That was all the detectives needed. She looked back at Adrian with something raw and ugly now, charm stripped away. "You think this makes you noble?" she hissed. "Clara was going to ruin everything. Simon had investors waiting. She would have dragged your name through every paper in the country. I kept your empire alive." "No," Adrian said. "You only taught me what it was built without." The detectives took her arms. She tried once to wrench free. Once only. Then the room, the lights, the cameras, the donors, all seemed to understand at the same instant that her power had never been grace. Only access. As they led her away, a voice spoke from the top of the staircase at the rear balcony. "Daddy!" The entire ballroom looked up. Theo stood there in a navy blazer, Elena one step behind him, horror on her face as if she had tried to stop him and failed. Adrian moved instinctively toward the stairs. But Theo, trembling and pale, looked not at the crowd, not at the cameras, at Vanessa, and in a clear, shaking voice that rang across crystal and silence alike, he said, "Mama said you were smiling wrong." Elena closed her eyes. Vanessa's expression finally collapsed into something unmistakable. The child had seen her, had remembered. The ballroom would never forget that moment. Adrian took the stairs 2 at a time. Theo was crying by the time his father reached him. "I'm sorry," the boy whispered. "I didn't stay upstairs." Adrian knelt in front of him and held his face gently between both hands. "Listen to me," he said. "You have nothing to be sorry for. Do you understand?" Theo nodded through tears. Adrian stood and wrapped one arm around his son. Then he looked at Elena. "Thank you," he said. It was far too small for what he meant, but she seemed to understand the rest. In the weeks that followed, newspapers performed their usual rituals. They called the case shocking, tragic, high-profile, stunning. They ran photos of Vanessa in handcuffs beside older photos of her smiling at charity luncheons. They used words like empire, scandal, betrayal, legacy, downfall. The tabloids wanted blood. The business press wanted governance analysis. Society columns wanted to know which donors had left the gala early and whether the flowers had been flown in from Holland. But inside the Vale House, something quieter and far more radical was happening. The silence was changing shape. Theo still had difficult days. Healing did not move like television. It lurched, stalled, circled back. Some mornings he spoke in short bursts and some days not at all. But he no longer seemed to believe that words were dangerous by default. He asked for scrambled eggs. He complained about rainy socks. He told Adrian, with 8-year-old severity, that adults ruined perfectly good evenings by discussing money too loudly. Adrian accepted every sentence as if it were gold handed back from the dead. He also changed. Not with speeches, with habits. He began taking breakfast at home every morning, no matter what crisis waited at the office. He moved meetings out of the evening and into hours that belonged to ambition anyway, not children. He turned Clara's old sitting room into a reading room for Theo and sat there with him, sometimes reading, sometimes only existing nearby until existence itself began to feel like love made visible. And Elena? She tried to resign. Of course she did. She came to Adrian's office on a bright Tuesday with an envelope in hand and the formal posture of someone prepared to leave before gratitude turned into dependency. "I think it would be best," she said. Adrian looked up from the papers he wasn't reading. "For whom?" Her grip tightened on the envelope. "For the household. For Theo. For you." "That's 3 different answers." She drew a breath. "People are talking. Reporters waited near the back gate yesterday. Mrs. Briggs says my presence has become complicated. Mrs. Briggs says many things." A flicker of unwilling amusement crossed Elena's face and vanished. Adrian stood. "Do you want to leave?" She hesitated too long. "That wasn't the question," he said more gently. Elena looked down at the envelope. "No." He crossed the room slowly, as one approaches frightened animals and painful truths. "Then let me answer the rest," he said. "Reporters can wait. Mrs. Briggs can survive complication. And Theo—" He stopped because Theo was the center of all honest sentences now. "Theo asks for you every day you are off shift." Her eyes filled before she could hide it. "He needs stability," she whispered. "He needs honesty," Adrian said. "So do I." The room held very still. Adrian had spent months hearing her whispers through a machine and weeks learning how false intimacy can become if it is never brought into daylight. He would not make that mistake with her. "I know more about you than I should," he said quietly. Not because I investigated you, because I listened when I should have turned away. The old nursery monitor was still connected. I heard the things you said to him. Shock moved across her face. Then hurt. Not theatrical hurt. Deep and personal. You listened. Yes. For how long? Too long. Elena stepped back as if struck. I should have told you, Adrian said. You should have stopped. I know. She looked at him with the full weight of betrayed dignity. Those moments were for him. And because of them, Adrian said, voice breaking despite himself, my son came back to me. She turned away and pressed her hand against her mouth. Adrian let the silence come. He had earned it. When she finally spoke, it was without turning around. I told him things he needed to hear. I would have told him anyway. But being listened to without knowing. She swallowed. That matters. Yes, Adrian said. It does. He waited. After a long moment she faced him again. Her eyes were wet but steady. Why tell me now? Because I'm tired of hiding behind reasons, he said. And because if you stay, you should do so knowing the truth. Elena looked at the resignation envelope, then slowly tore it once down the middle. Not as forgiveness, as postponement. Then if I stay, she said, it will not be as a maid who can be sent anywhere and told nothing. Adrian nodded. What do you want? She thought for a moment. I want training. Real training. Child development. Trauma care. Speech support. I want enough pay to move my brother somewhere safer. And I want Theo never spoken about as if he is broken in front of people who only understand polished rooms. Adrian felt something close to pride move through him, though none of it belonged to him. Done, he said. She blinked. Just like that. No, Adrian said. Not just like that. Like something I should have offered much earlier. And so the arrangement changed. Elena stopped wearing the household uniform. At her own request, she was placed formally on staff as Theo's developmental aide, while attending coursework Adrian funded, but never framed as charity. Matteo moved into a better apartment with proper accessibility support and later began an apprenticeship with the Foundation's media department because, as Theo solemnly informed everyone, Elena's brother is good with sound and all our people should stay near us. Mrs. Briggs adapted with the grace of someone who had privately always approved and merely preferred the right paperwork. Months passed. The criminal case deepened. Simon pleaded for leniency and received none worth wanting. The mechanic confessed. Vanessa fought, denied, revised, wept, and finally faced the fate of people who mistake sophistication for immunity. Clara's name was restored publicly. The foundation was rebuilt privately. And love, real love, the kind that arrives after devastation and therefore refuses performance, grew in the Vale house without anyone announcing it. It showed itself first in ordinary places. In the kitchen, where Adrian learned Elena drank coffee too strong and forgot sugar when tired. In the garden, where Theo, mud on both knees, ordered them to stop talking like careful adults and help him rescue a drowning worm after rain. In the library, where Elena laughed once, truly laughed, at one of Matteo's impressions over speakerphone, and Adrian looked up from his book because the sound transformed the room. He did not speak first. That mattered. She did. Nearly a year after the gala, on a spring afternoon bright enough to make the rose bushes look painted, Elena found Adrian in the reading room helping Theo glue together a model ship that had already capsized twice on the carpet. Theo glanced between them with suspicious intelligence. Then he announced, I'm going to get more glue, and vanished with the transparent strategy of children who know adults are slow but not blind. Elena stood in the doorway smiling. He did that on purpose, Adrian said. Yes. A quiet stretched between them, gentle and lived in. Adrian set down the broken mast. Your final certification came in this morning. Her face lit at once. You saw it. I may have certain advantages in this house. She laughed softly. You mean you still open mail that isn't yours? Only when it contains excellent news. She stepped farther into the room. Matteo says that counts as a personality flaw. Matteo has become unexpectedly bold. He says wealth loses all mystery Once you've seen a billionaire searching the pantry for cinnamon crackers at midnight. Adrian smiled, and there it was again, that feeling of being restored by someone who never set out to rescue him. "Elena," he said. The room quieted. She looked at him fully then. "I know what this began as," he said. "Employment, crisis, survival." He drew a slow breath. "I also know what it became before I deserved to name it. You changed this house. You changed my son's life. You changed mine. And I don't want to make the mistake of speaking too late again." Her eyes softened but did not lower. "I am not asking you for gratitude," he said. "And I am not asking while you are under this roof as my employee. If you want, we can leave every arrangement exactly as it is professionally and never speak of this again." He stepped closer, no farther. "But if you would allow me, sometime outside these walls, outside these roles, I would like to take you to dinner." For a second she did not answer. Then she looked down at the ship on the carpet and back up at him. "Theo will say he predicted this," she murmured. "Then I'll have to pretend I'm surprised." "You're not good at pretending." Adrian let out a breath that became a small laugh. "That is no longer true. I was excellent at pretending. It nearly ruined us all." The honesty of that line settled between them. At last Elena said, "Dinner would be nice." Theo returned 2 seconds later with glue and the expression of a child who had absolutely been listening from the hallway. "Good," he said far too loudly. "Because next Saturday I'm sleeping at Mateo's, and adults need chances." Adrian stared at him. Elena covered her mouth, laughing. Theo knelt on the carpet with the glue and muttered, "You're welcome," as if coordinating his father's romantic future were merely another household duty. A year later, on an autumn morning touched by gold light, the house that had once felt embalmed by silence opened its windows wide. The garden was dressed in white roses and blue ribbons because Theo insisted the colors belonged to our family now. Mateo stood near the front arch in a suit that made him look both proud and uncomfortable. Mrs. Briggs cried before the ceremony even began and denied it to everyone, including herself. Malcolm Shore attended in a tie too stiff for happiness but smiled anyway. Dr. Levin brought books instead of gifts because by then she knew the family well enough to understand what mattered. Elena did not walk down the aisle as a maid rescued by wealth. She walked as herself, a trained specialist, a sister, a woman who had entered a broken house carrying nothing but steadiness and had refused to become small within it. Adrian waited for her beneath the arch with Theo at his side. When the officiant asked who gave the bride, Mateo said, "No one gives Elena. She chooses." Elena laughed through tears. Theo, now entirely recovered in the dangerous way of healthy children who begin speaking and never intend to stop, whispered loudly enough for half the garden to hear, "That was the best line, Uncle Mateo." When Adrian took Elena's hands, he did not think about the mansion, or the companies, or the cameras that once followed his life. He thought about rain on windows, about a child under a piano, about an old monitor crackling in a dark security room, while a woman with no promise of reward whispered hope into silence. He thought about all the ways love first arrives unnoticed by people trained to respect grand entrances. And when the ceremony ended and the applause rose around them, Theo hugged Elena first, then Adrian, then both of them together with all the force of a child who had once believed words could destroy a family and now used them to bind one together. That evening, long after guests had gone and the garden lights dimmed, Adrian found Theo half asleep in the reading room beneath the same constellation quilt Clara had once chosen for him. "Too much cake?" Adrian asked. Theo nodded. Adrian sat on the edge of the sofa. After a moment Theo said, "Mama would like Elena." The ache in Adrian's chest was old now, but it no longer felt like punishment. More like weather, part of the landscape of loving and losing honestly. "Yes," Adrian said. "She would." Theo rested his head against his father's shoulder. "You heard her first, didn't you?" the boy asked drowsily. Adrian went still. "Heard who?" "Elena. Before you talked to her for real." Theo's eyes were closed. "I knew." Adrian let out a quiet breath. "Was I that obvious?" "No," Theo murmured. "Just lonely." The word landed softly and without accusation. Adrian kissed the top of his son's head. "I was," he admitted. Theo smiled in the nearly sleeping way children do when truth has become ordinary enough not to frighten them. "Not now," he said. "No," Adrian whispered. "Not now." Outside, the night settled over the house with none of the old pressure in it. The clocks still marked time. The floors still shone. The windows still caught rain when storms passed. But the mansion no longer sounded like a museum of unfinished grief. It sounded like a home, one with footsteps, laughter, arguments over breakfast geometry, late coffee, family schedules pinned crookedly to the kitchen board, and the occasional shouted reminder from Theo that no one was allowed to touch his blue stones by the fountain. People who told the story later said many things. They said a millionaire learned too late that wealth cannot overhear what love is brave enough to whisper. They said a child returned from silence because one woman spoke to his wound instead of around it. They said evil dresses well, kindness usually doesn't, and houses reveal their true owners only after sorrow has tested everyone inside them. All of that was true, but the truest part was simpler. A man pretended to ignore the maid because he did not know how to enter his own son's pain. And while he listened from a distance, she taught him that children do not need perfect fathers, only honest ones. That grief does not shrink when hidden. That dignity can walk in wearing plain shoes and change an empire more completely than ambition ever could. That the quietest voices in a house are often the ones holding it up. And if there is any lesson worth keeping from the life of Adrian Vale, it is this. Money can build gates, wings, ballrooms, foundations, and family names engraved in stone. But it cannot comfort a frightened child in the dark, cannot turn guilt into healing, cannot teach a broken man how to become gentle. Only love can do that, and sometimes love arrives not with trumpets, promises, or perfect timing, but in a whisper beside a child's bed, in the patience to wait for a voice to return, and in the courage to stop pretending you cannot hear it.